Hello and welcome to a new interview from MinnMax. MinnMax is a Patreon about games, friends, and getting better. My name is Ben Hansen. Thank you for being here. I am very excited for today's interview guest. Today's guest is John Dickerson, who you might know from 60 Minutes, CBS News. He was the host of Face the Nation. You might know him from the Slate Political Gabfest. It is not very often here at our video game network, MinnMax, to have somebody who's interviewed multiple presidents, but we're honored to have John Dickerson join us to talk about his new book, The Hardest Job in the World, which is about the American presidency. So if you're a fan of history, we think you'll get something out of this discussion, talking about the highs and lows of the American presidency, big misconceptions about the job itself. But that's not all, because the reason this interview happened realistically is that John Dickerson is a big fan of Age of Empires, which I am also a big fan of that series. And there was news recently about Age of Empires 4 and gameplay revealed. He is desperately trying to find a new game to play based on a bunch of different criteria. So any help leaving a comment below to let him know what games he can check out, I'm sure he'd appreciate it. And I'd love to see what you'd recommend to him. If you enjoy content like this, we'd always appreciate it if you subscribe to MinnMax's YouTube channel, checked out our other interviews. Most are about video games, but there's some other topics in there as well. Or you can go to patreon.com/MinnMax with 2 N's and support us to unlock the podcast version of this interview, all of our other interviews, early access to the MinnMax Show podcast, the Deepest Dive, which are huge community game club discussions. There's a lot of very fun stuff. So we'd always appreciate it if you help support independent games media. But without further ado, here's John Dickerson. John Dickerson, welcome to MinnMax, sir.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
It is an honor to have you. Some people might think this is a weird connection. MinnMax is primarily about games. We're also about getting better and friends. But for the video game connection, I'm really trying to think of a way to connect it to the hardest job in the world. It's like you do write about video games a little bit in there. There's a quote about Pac-Man.
Yeah.
A quote about
Yes, although boy, that's a stretch. I think the quote about Pac-Man is Ronald Reagan saying that Tip O'Neill was like Pac-Man, that he and his penchant for government spending is he gobbled up whatever he saw.
Yeah, he's a round thing that gobbles up money.
Here's what I will. That's right. I think you can make the connection though, which is that, and I know we'll talk about Age of Empires at some point soon.
Of course.
So rather than just a Twitch computer game, Call of Duty or something like that. On a massive game like Age of Empires, you have to keep lots of balls in the air. You have to be paying attention to your map, and you have to be paying attention to your resources, and you have to be paying attention and aware which portions of your army are best suited to be attacking or defending against which portions of the advancing armies. You have to, if you're really good and you get assigned a civilization instead of just playing with the one you like, you have to be able to adapt really quickly to a set of attributes that aren't the ones you're maybe most comfortable with. And that sense when you're playing a complicated game with lots of shifting things you have to tend, that is actually kind of like, or the closest thing I would say to a presidency, where you have an unrelenting set of immediate demands, which can distract you from the more important things that you need to tend to win by some overall strategy. And that's what lots of those games are about, right?
Yeah.
Which is, you've got barbarians at the gate, and sometimes you have to let them, break it down a little bit because you're tending something that in about 20 minutes is going to be crucial. And if you don't deal with it now, you won't be alive. 20 minutes will come and that'll be the end of it if you haven't made sufficient advanced preparation. So I guess that's the closest that I could come in terms of making an analogy between the two.
I love it. No, I mean, I think your book is really fascinating, just on that level from, I hate to define myself as just a gamer, but from a gamer's mind, with an obsession on games, you become obsessed with systems and maximizing systems, optimizing systems. And I think that's a lot of what your book is about. And that's why it's really interesting just about, how do you maximize an office? MinnMax, what we're named after. It's like basically your book is about min-maxing the presidency, making the most, optimal path from minimum to maximum here.
Right. I mean, and so systems design and being interested in systems is one of the things that it doesn't come from my video game career, which to the extent I had one was mostly, with machines that don't even exist anymore. But to the extent that I have tried to learn as an adult So in my gaming career, I can't play really Twitch games anymore because as much as I have liked some of them, desperately liked some of them, it's just too fast and it tweaks me out. So, but there are strategy games where you have to develop systems and then maintain those systems. And, the endless YouTube watching of the best 17 moves to make at the beginning of a Company of Heroes is basically like what it's like at the beginning of every presidency. There are a whole set of steps that you can do to maximize through the basic idea of compound interest. Small events that take place at the beginning have larger impacts over time. Well, that's true in the presidency. And I think the idea of systems, developing them, thinking about them, and maintaining them for their own sake, which is based on this notion that if you have a system and you tend it, that it will work in the end. That is at the heart of any complex organization. It should be at the heart of the presidency and the way we talk about the presidency, but it isn't. It seems like some weird kind of excessively nerdy pursuit. And the fact of the matter is, when you look at what my book is essentially saying, and it was written before COVID-19, the argument was, if you don't develop systems and you don't tend your systems, you will be unable to handle any of the kinds of surprises that are a part of the presidency. Every president is faced with a surprise. And so you should build your systems based on that idea. And yet we don't really talk about the presidency that way.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So in the modern era, maybe, who do you think has run the most efficient White House from your standpoint?
Well, it depends what we mean by efficient.
Of course.
It depends what we mean by, part of what I'm wrestling with in the book is what is the best way to measure some of these things. So here's one of my favorite recent examples that I'm wrestling with. So there was a president before Donald Trump, who was in office and became so concerned about the idea of a pandemic hitting the United States and wiping out a huge swath of the population, that he tasked his top security officials with coming up with a plan for how to handle a pandemic. The plan that this president asked for was not going to help with the presidency of that particular president. But the president felt like it was his obligation to prepare for the future and to put something in place that would basically have a ready-made system on the shelf so that if something happened, everybody would know how to respond. Because he knew that when these big things happen, as they say in the disaster circles, a disaster is the wrong time to be handing out business cards. If you haven't built a system and haven't developed relationships on how to tackle these things, when the crisis hits, you're going to be unprepared. You can't just add water and have a response. And it was simply by the level of that president's conviction that he got an entire portion of the bureaucracy to focus on this idea of pandemic preparedness. The plan was put together, a thorough plan was put together, and it was on the shelf ready to go. So who was that president? That was George W. Bush. Now, a lot of people, when they think of George W. Bush, they think of the disastrous Iraq War, and they think of the post-war experience, and they also think of the response to Hurricane Katrina. So his foresight on pandemic preparedness and the initiative that created a plan that was actually used by other countries. The problem with the plan is it wasn't used by America, but other countries used America's pandemic preparedness plan and saved tens of thousands of lives. So there you have a president who is, left office with his approval ratings in the basement, who is regularly relegated to the third, which is to say the lowest rank of presidents when they're ranked by historians. And yet his foresight and approach to a long-term challenge like pandemic preparedness was basically as good as you would ever want in a presidency. So that's an instance in which you can have a presidency that is overall judged to have been among the lowest, nevertheless has an example inside of it that is one of the best examples of how to be prepared. So when I think about which presidents are the best at these kinds of things, and oh, by the way, nobody knew that he was preparing for a pandemic.
Of course, yeah.
And wouldn't have if we hadn't been hit by COVID-19. It would have been something that he had a bunch of people do that, like some footnote in a FEMA internal paper might have taken note of. But of course, because we just spent a year poorly managing and responding to a pandemic. We're all a lot more interested in the history of pandemic preparedness. Barack Obama used to say that nobody knew who his FEMA director was, Craig Fugate, because Craig Fugate handled the job well, as opposed to President Bush's FEMA director, the famous Brown, you're doing a heck of a job, Brownie, who will be remembered forever as for his role in botching Hurricane Katrina, which, by the way, it wasn't entirely his fault. So I guess, but my point with President Obama was you didn't know Craig Fugate because he did the job well. There's a lot of the presidency where presidents do things well. We don't see it. And so we don't tend to give them success for the things that don't turn out to be disasters.
Yeah, reading your book, I'm constantly going back and forth between being amazed by how much we know about the presidency. Like, there is a surprising amount of insight and details that we just have public record of, which is, it seems like a miracle. And then at times I'm also on the flip side, I read Obama's recent book. And it's like, there are so many things I had no idea about. I mean, just certain people that are so important, like Reggie Love, where it's like, I've barely heard that name. And it turns out it's one of the most important voices in his life. And so where are you on that spectrum between being amazed by how much we know versus we should still be constantly humbled by we have no idea what it's like in that office?
Well, I take the second position as my general approach to life, which is that we should be humbled by what little we know about anything even the thing that we spend, and maybe particularly the thing that we spend the most time thinking about, because the more you think and know about something, the more you realize how little you know. But Al Gore was asked during the Clinton administration what percentage of the White House he felt, being vice president, he really saw and could understand. And he said about 5%. And that wasn't a testament to his being out of the loop. It was that the organization of the presidency is gargantuan. We think of it as a single person's job. It's not. It's an organization. It's a massive company. We wouldn't think of Apple Computers as just Tim Cook. And we shouldn't think of the presidency just as the president. And that's a problem in the way we think about the job. So I'm constantly surprised. You mentioned President Obama's book. It's an interesting book. Obviously, like all presidents who write about their tenures, he's telling it in the most favorable light. But he does a pretty good job conveying the sense of the job, which was comforting to me because it came out after my book came out. And so I was, you have a lot of theories. I interviewed President Obama, I interviewed other presidents and lots of people who worked in White Houses. But, you arrange all of this into a theory of the case. And so it's nice when one of the few living presidents actually, says things that are consistent with what you wrote. But as you know, in the book, he tells the story about in his inaugural address, his very first words as president, he was preparing. He had in his pocket an emergency evacuation plan in case some Somali terrorists who had targeted his inauguration were successful in their plot. And he was going to have to read the overwhelming crowd that was before him, read them evacuation instructions because there would have been a terrorist event. So here he's not even really got the job, and he's already worrying about something that might happen, and he can't let on to anybody that this might happen. And so, that to me is basically what the job is. You are constantly having to live in two different worlds. And so back to your question, there's always that hidden world that we never see. And so I'm constantly aware of that.
Yeah. I wonder if you can shed any light on other moments of underappreciated honesty from presidents. Like there's a moment in the book where, God, I forget which actor it is, but FDR is talking to an actor and he says something along the lines of, we're the two greatest actors in the United States or in the world. That's such an amazing moment. Which actor was it again?
Orson Welles.
Of course. Yeah. Do you have other moments that really stand out as like, oh, that's incredibly revealing that quote is even out there for just shedding light on what it's actually like to be a president?
Well, Lyndon Johnson had a lot of those, where he talked about the powerlessness of the job. He said, the presidency is sometimes like sometimes the presidency is like being a jackass in a hailstorm. You have to just sit there and take it. And he's basically right. Eisenhower said a lot of things that weren't, I'll finish on LBJ. He was right, which is that sometimes the president's job is to be the person who gets beat up for things that the country's unhappy about. A, because the country needs an outlet. B, because people who have the president's political interests at heart will see the president getting beaten up and rally around and do what's necessary to try to fix the situation. And if it's for something like a natural disaster or something that can be improved through public policy, their affection for the president, or at least their desire to make him improve his standing politically, ends up leading to a good result for a greater number of people. So there's a way in which abuse of the president is a kind of blunt and clumsy, but nevertheless potentially useful way to get good policy. But Eisenhower used to write about that when he talked about leadership. He kind of dropped the mask when it came to the kind of pretending that a leader has to do in order to basically buck up the troops, even when the leader is completely terrified inside. He talked a lot about the idea that you have to show a constant face of optimism. So that's not a burning truth secret that he's spilling, but it is an aspect of the job, which is, presidents don't usually admit that they're often carrying on a public display that's quite distinct from their private behavior. And FDR used to talk about that too. How basically, if he needed to tell one person something and then tell somebody else the exact opposite to get a deal or get something done, then he was fine with that.
Yeah. This is a tricky question, but scale of 1 to 10, how much is it just all an act? I mean, all of DC. I mean, when you're hosting Face the Nation, the cameras go off, is just, oh boy, you wouldn't believe that load of BS over there. I mean, is it just everybody lets their guard down fully?
There was a time where there was probably some of that, where basically everybody agreed, much in the way they do in families or in polite society, to maintain certain fictions that are the necessary lubricant of social commerce. I mean, so, your spouse asks for your opinion. There are those times where it's necessary that you give your most stark opinion. And there are other times where the stakes may not be so high that you want to give the absolute unvarnished truth. This is true with friendships. This is true with family relations. You'll tolerate interactions for a brief period of time, even with people who you might not have a super favorable opinion of. So there was a lot of that in Washington. And what that allowed was for people to live to fight another day. In other words, you knew you were always going to have to work with each other in one form or another because of the way politics was structured. Parties had to work together more in the past. And so a lot of those rituals, which were phony, nevertheless kind of allowed the business of the city to go forward. Now, to the extent that they're totally phony, and we have, the presidents are lying about actions in Vietnam, are lying about the actions related to Watergate, lying about the pretext for the Vietnam War. Obviously that's not good and that shouldn't be tolerated. And that comes into a totally different category. But there used to be a lot of excessive politeness in Washington that was kind of tolerated and was kind of the part of the deal. But a lot of that's gone now. A lot of that's gone in the age of partisanship and in the age of kind of affirmative bad faith behavior on the part of a lot of politicians.
Yeah. After doing so much research about the office, how to get things done, the history of who's gotten things done more efficiently, all that stuff. I mean, do people call you for advice? New politicians in DC? You seem like an amazing resource. And would you have conflicted feelings about offering a politician advice like that?
They do. And usually I don't offer it because it's not my job to offer advice. I mean, one of the reasons I write books or do the public work that I do is if somebody wants to read that and draw conclusions, then that's great. Yeah. Advice gets into an advocacy lane. I mean, I want people of all parties and faiths and beliefs and so forth to, work in the public good and to be as efficient and productive as possible and to, live lives of meaning. So I don't want to sound like I'm not trying to help, but because of the nature of partisanship at this level of time. But this has always been true when I've been asked by both parties to come work in various jobs. I just felt like that's not my role. But having said that, there are a lot of times when you do interviews in the best, and this goes back kind of to your previous question, in the best conception of what a reporter does is it's a kind of public puzzling out of the way things should work and why they should work that way and where the contradictions are and kind of a collective effort to get at what the truth is. That's in the best conception. If you spend all of your time in reporting trying to chase somebody around the table just to get them to admit what their name is, then that's a lot of what it's become, and particularly on television, then that's actually reducing the net level of information and understanding. And in that case, you're engaged in something that's completely antithetical to why you got into business.
Yeah.
So I don't know if somebody called from an administration, would I wonder, I mean, these are my principles and I've upheld them over time. But at the moment, I feel like, particularly on this question of the presidency and the way we misunderstand what it is, I feel a kind of I really want to try to get that argument across. And so if I felt like it was helpful if it was helpful to get that idea out there by talking to somebody in the administration, I wonder if I would collapse under the request.
Like you mentioned, ultimately the presidency is a job, is in some ways like running a business. Did you think a lot about writing this book about your own career and think about like, I could have written this book about, working at 60 Minutes or working at CBS? Maybe not the hardest job in the world, but it would have been called a pretty tricky job. Actually, no, just because I was a print journalist and still am. But for most of my career, which meant I basically worked alone. When you have an editor, but that's it. You don't run an organization. And so I actually have no idea. And in 60 Minutes and in other television things, which are an organization, I don't work on that portion of it. I'm actually, when you're the anchor of a show, it's a little different. I mean, so I've now worked on 3 different shows in 3 different kind of anchor level positions. Face the Nation, I was much more involved, but on the kind of editorial, it's like you have 2 steering wheels, which is a metaphor that has no analog in real life. But anyway, one is the kind of putting on the show, the logistics of the thing itself, and then the other is editorial. And so I was very much involved in the editorial part, probably to the chagrin of lots of people, but in terms of making the show go and knowing about the timing and the satellite trucks and the camera angles and the graphics and all that, I had almost no role. Right.
So no, I didn't really think, I did a lot of the reporting I did was trying to learn how organizations work, learn how the presidency works and why it's in many, many, many ways not at all like a business. And then the ways in which it is like a business, why doesn't it operate that way? So for example, in business, hiring and putting together a staff is one of the things CEOs care about the most. And they really think through how to put together a good team. In government, it's really hard to do that. The workforce, there's a lot of political payoff you've got to maintain and do. Then a portion of the workforce you're not really in control of. It's from a organizational standpoint, the hiring process with the presidency is kind of a mess. So in that way, it's also not like a business, but the business world, which has some sort of best practices in that area, it's really hard to graft them onto a huge organization like the presidency.
Yeah. I'm amazed by your career and how you always seem so peaceful and sane and have a nice perspective on everything in what seems like the most infuriating town maybe in the world. I don't know if you have any tips for how to keep your sanity. Are you screaming into a bag every night? What's happening? How do you do this?
Well, I'm 52, so part of it is just having, after a while you can't respond that way to everything or you just would wear yourself out. So part of it is I think, at least in my own case, I'm a little more restrained because I know that some things will kind of play out. Something that is acute and that I'm worried about at the moment is going to work itself out. So you can apportion some of your concern to some amount of things that you know are going to fall of their own weight, or people will come to different, conclusions. You don't have to fight every single, issue. Then other things are basically trying to keep your priorities in line. There was a time when I would have gone to the mat on every tiny little thing, which ends up exhausting you and having long-term costs.
And that means like in individual like interviews? You mean just not dropping a point, or?
Yeah, either individual interviews or in task work when you're doing collaborative task work. There is important task-related tension that's necessary in a creative endeavor. So that's fine, and there are going to be moments of conflict. But there are times when, you can win your point, and you can get it the way you're going to get it, but it has a cost. It has a cost to long-term task work that you might do with the same person. Well, that's the main cost, really. And so is it worth, an hour's worth of really tough back and forth to something that you can let drop and not only save the hour, but then save future collaborations, because a victory after an hour's worth of acrimony can leave long-term reputational damage with the people you're working with, and not improve the specific task you're working on a whole heck of a lot.
Yeah.
And then I guess the other thing really is to try to keep the things that give me meaning and that are my values at the center of everything I do. And so to make sure that at any given moment, I can answer yes to the question, am I being the person I want to be right now? And so if you can say yes to that as much as possible, that tends to be centering.
Yeah, well, that's nice. I have a very nerdy question for you. I guess all these are a little bit nerdy. That's the nature of the book in a certain way. But I'm curious about your note-taking strategy. Do you just have Google Docs? How do you remind yourself about, news stories that happened a couple years ago that might be a good lead? Do you have any good tips for just how to keep track of the world? Yeah,
I'm looking for my... So one of the things is that I've carried a notebook in my back pocket since I was 18. Field Notes brand has been my brand of choice for the last maybe 8-10 years. I used to have a very, very fancy notebook that my father gave me when I was 18, made by very fancy stationers, Smythson. They are extremely expensive. They're leather. They have beautiful Bible leaves inside. I mean, they're gorgeous if you make $1 billion. But the downside of that, and I used to buy them for myself, and it was quite a thing. But they lasted for a pretty good while. You could have the same one in your back pocket for like 4 or 5 months. The problem is if you lose one, then you've lost everything in it. And so I switched to Field Notes because they're incredibly durable, and I go through them faster. Which means if I lose one, I'm only losing a couple of weeks worth of work. But basically following David Allen's Getting Things Done, the biggest thing is capturing whatever is in your head. So that's what the notebook does. It's a place to capture those ideas. And then you go back at the end of the day and see what are those things that occurred to me while I was in the middle of other things that I need to think through or get on top of or stay on top of.
And at some point, you can open the Dickerson library, where it's just every notebook you've ever had.
Well, I do have a couple of big boxes full of all those notebooks, and I'm thinking through what to do with them, because they have both the minutia of daily life and then also ideas that have occurred to me, which I probably should have moved on earlier in my career. But I have a kind of complicated note-taking scheme, which also includes a legal pad, which I write on while I'm reading, and then I use OneNote. I used Evernote for a long time. I've switched to OneNote about 6 months ago. I'd switched before, and then I switched back to Evernote, and now I'm back to OneNote again. It has the interface is better. You can do more on an individual page. The highlighting is more useful.
Yeah.
It didn't used to have tagging, which Evernote has, and used to be its great feature. But the tagging is now just fine on OneNote, and Evernote stripped itself of a lot of its best features when they did one of their upgrades, basically destroying it for me. So
yeah.
Anyway, that's about half of the process. It goes on, but we'd be here till breakfast.
Well, hey, you teased it earlier. Age of Empires. Every once in a while, you tweet about Age of Empires, and there is nothing more in my wheelhouse than you talking about Age of Empires. So thank you for that. What is your history with the series? What do you love about the series?
Well, so just briefly to give you my video game background.
Yeah.
So when I was a kid, I used to work for Atari.
What?
When I was just starting to program, when I was in 7th and 8th grade, I had a Radio Shack computer, a TRS-80, and then I switched it for an Atari because Atari made better games, and the Atari 800 was, had better graphics and had color, and so anyway, so I sort of played all of those games that people don't even know anymore. I mean, well, I guess Asteroids, it would be, and it's like Space Invaders and that kind of thing. Those are the early first versions. I guess I played a lot of arcade Pac-Man and Tron and all those. So, but then basically Desert until getting out of college. And my wife and I used to play the original Dungeons and Dragons games. There was the original point of view games, and then there were ones which were a little bit like, well, not really like Age of Empires, but you had 5 characters, and instead of being point of view, it was top down.
Yeah.
And those were great. Those were such good games, and we would stay up the entire through the night to finish some quest. Then basically Desert. Doom comes out. I played with my childhood friend, Kevin McDonnell, the first networked game I think I ever played, where we played against each other I guess it must have been the first Doom. And that was like the greatest thing I think had ever been conceived of man. The joy we had was like we were 6 years old again. Then basically, that's it. Then Age of Empires, I don't know what, I had always, we played lots. I mean, I've tried Elder Scrolls. I've tried lots and lots and lots and lots of games.
Yeah.
And never been able to stick with them. Age of Empires hit the sweet spot for strategy, sufficient battle play that it's not just sort of press a button and watch everybody fight. You have some control over it. The fact that you can actually even select individual archers or pikemen and is great. I mean, in my perfect conception of the game, you would be allowed to zoom in and actually be one of the, pick one character, zoom in and actually fight as that character, for basically purely just the fun of swordplay. But what I loved about Age of Empires was then we could play it in the house. So my son and I used to play, and my daughter was not as interested, but she would play. So there were times where the 4 of us in the house would be playing all together.
That's so fun.
So when the kids were young.
And this is Age of Empires 2 specifically?
This is 2. It must have been 2. So what would happen is basically there would be an hour of Dad cursing the router to try to get the incredibly finicky multiplayer Age of Empires 2 to sync between the 4 computers. And there were various different generations. So there was, whatever was my old work laptop, it was barely hanging on. And I think this was when you needed the CD-ROM to play.
Yep.
So at one point we had to buy multiple versions of the CD-ROM in order to have this. But I mean, there's nothing more fun than having 4 members of a family all fighting. And we usually do common objective. We wouldn't fight against each other because soon enough my son was so good that you'd just be buried in a hail of trebuchet fire because he was just better and faster. But then there was also a period where it was a great stress reliever on the road because I spent a great deal of time on the road. And it just, you just don't have to think about, because you're so consumed with trying to, build farms and get into the feudal age and level up. And then also, there were times where I would play just at the edge of my competence. And these games would go on for hours against the computer, or sometimes some, probably like 12-year-old in Des Moines, Iowa, who was playing in the middle of the night on a multiplayer game, who would, allow me to chase around the map and try various strategies before ultimately losing, or maybe even barely winning at the end. And then recently I've been waiting for 4, like the rest of creation.
Yep.
3 never did it for us. And
Mythology, did you play it all?
What's that?
Age of Mythology, did you ever check out?
No.
Oh,
no.
it's so good, John. It's
okay.
It's excellent.
Good. Well, I'll write that down. And also, by the way, we tried and there was a period in where I did spend a lot of time on SimCity when I was younger, and then so Civilization kind of felt like it was matching those
For
two.
sure.
But I could never quite get there with, in the same way that Civilization didn't scratch the Age of Empires / SimCity itch. So too I felt with Elder Scrolls and Lord of the Rings Online, and although we did play some Lord of the Rings Online, where it never did for me what those original Dungeons and Dragons games used to do, which was the totally immersive fighting plus problem solving. That is the key for me. Just enough problems and not too difficult that that you can solve them, and then there's enough mayhem so that you're not doing puzzles all day long.
Yeah.
It's not like Myst and, it's just puzzles. So anyway.
Yeah. But what are you looking forward to with Age of Empires 4? What's your best case scenario for their design of Age of Empires 4?
Oh, I don't. So I guess the best case scenario is, so when I think of the most fun that I've had in Age of Empires, it is the ability to hatch a scheme. So for a period of time, I became fascinated by basically driving the enemy through a kind of, corridor that I had created through a variety of ideas, and then just basically bombarding them as they came down the corridor, either by baiting them and pulling them through the corridor created either by trees or by, sometimes you can put up just some wooden fencing and they'll be dumb enough to kind of come down your corridor.
Right.
And then just, slaughtering them once they get inside the, and I've tried things like once they get in, walling off the back and doing other things to basically, so it's the ability to kind of hatch a somewhat harebrained scheme, the way you used to design football plays on your chest when you played football in the street, turn left at the fire hydrant, then head fake and then run for the Datsun. So sufficient gameplay so that you can do those, that you have kind of lots of authorship of your own wacky strategies. And then I guess graphics that are immersive enough. I mean, there are times when if you're really into a game, you kind of you get very sort of emotionally connected to your strategy. And I think the graphics, the better the sense of realism, the more the deeply that feels for me. Different civilization. I haven't ever become good enough where, some of the new civilizations seem very cool. I'm basically, stick with the Britons and learn the best of the Britons. I'm not good enough yet to learn how to adapt to the various different civilizations.
Right.
I still have to remind myself that, because I got good and then I've just been very bad for a long time. But, I still have to remind myself of which, pikemen against horsemen and all of that. And I just sort of get lost in the beauty of the game, and it doesn't, then everything's turned to ash as I have the wrong soldiers fighting the wrong soldiers. So part of it is, I felt recently I've been playing Company of Heroes. Yeah. And I really like Company of Heroes has a lot of the same stuff. In terms of, what I like about Company of Heroes is I feel like I have a sense of the world. It's not so sprawling.
Right.
And so it feels that intimate feeling makes it feel just very much more connected. So I would hope that Age of Empires would be able to scale that.
Yeah. And
so if you want to have a massive map, great. Otherwise, you can have control over a tiny little interesting battle.
Yeah. Have you seen that Age of Empires 4 is being developed by Relic, the same studio that made Company of Heroes?
Oh, it's so funny you mentioned that. I saw that and it didn't, because you have to watch the Relic thing every time it loads. And so it's funny, it didn't click. This is how kind of out of it I am.
That's fine. Whenever you want to be in it, you can call up. We'll tell you everything that's happening in the world of video games, a nice little debrief.
Well, I wish, actually, that is what I need. I was talking, this will sound like name dropping, because in part it is, so Colson Whitehead, the amazing novelist, won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for back-to-back novels. Basically, when he finishes writing a novel, he goes and plays video games. And so at one point during the interview, he said, I'm like a middle-aged guy. I look up online what's the most popular game, and then I find it and I go play it. And so I think that led him to Red Dead Redemption, which he really liked, which it's in the on-deck circle for a long time.
Did you play the first one?
No.
Okay.
I've never played any of it. And I'm kind of like that too. And every time I've sought a Age of Empires because there was that period of Age of Empires where they basically let it go fallow, where Microsoft just I wasn't upgrading, it wasn't. I was kind of looking for that alternative, and so tried lots of other different games, and none of them did it for me. And so what I would love is a decision tree that basically allowed me, or not a decision tree, but a thing that let me say, I want the strategy of Age of Empires. I want a little of the hand-to-hand combat of any of your first-person shooter games.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be a shooter, but enough of the hand-to-hand so that I can get that adrenaline rush, but not so much that I have to sit and have a nap afterwards because I've frayed my nerves. Just watching my son play any of those first-person shooter games I can't even watch them because it's just my eyes are too old for it.
Yeah. So the interesting thing is like the real-time strategy genre, which Age of Empires is, the RTS, that kind of gave birth 10 years ago, 15 years ago to a genre that's now called MOBAs. Kind of Dota is the big one there, where basically it's a long, complicated story, but it's like you're controlling and focusing on one unit in an RTS game. And so that kind of would give you some of that adrenaline rush. They are huge games. I mean, I know AOC plays a lot of League of Legends. That's kind of in that vein. So if you look at those games, they are kind of the children of the RTS genre in a strange way.
Do you control your one unit and the rest of the world goes on by itself, or do you also have control over the rest of the world?
You're mainly just controlling the one unit and then working as a team. But it's very, very intense, and there's a lot to learn. And even as somebody who plays a lot of games, I am very scared of those games. But, I mean, people in Congress are playing it, so how hard can it be?
Well, that's also the question, is the ramp-up time. Like Age of Empires, even if you're not doing very well, you can sort of satisfy yourself that you have some pretty, your farms are neatly arranged, and, maybe you were able to if you're playing against somebody who's really good, maybe you were able to build a castle and you won one little battle, and you can have a sufficient experience without having to win. But then there are other games where the ramp up time is so huge and you have to remember all these different, and that's too much, my life is so shredded that's really hard for me to do, is to retain the knowledge from, because it might go 6 months between playing games. And so I enjoyed Witcher.
Interesting.
Both the game and the TV show. But I felt like Witcher, I couldn't keep up with where I was because I wasn't playing it consistently enough. And that was true. The Lord of the Rings on Xbox One is really, really good. It's first person, but and gets a little twitchy, but it's okay. It's like it's stressed in tolerable ranges. But again, don't play it for 8 months and then I don't remember anything that's going on, let alone the muscle memory that's required.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious to see what people recommend for you in the comments on this video. I mean, Rise of Nations is kind of like an interesting fusion between Civilization and Age of Empires, but it doesn't have that maybe action element that you're focusing on. I mean, Warcraft 3 is more about smaller units. I don't know if you're into the Warcraft or Starcraft series.
We tried Warcraft at one point. Also, there's a whole other thing which will tell more than I mean to, but when my wife and I used to play Dungeons and Dragons, it was before we had kids, and we basically would shut ourselves in for a weekend, and it was so much fun. And there's not been another game that Age of Empires, even when we played it networked as a family, it was just really my son and me who were the most obsessed.
Yeah.
And I would love to be able to play a game where, and there was a little bit of this with Lord of the Rings Online, where, I could play as a fighter and she could be a mage or an elf or a thief, and sort of the characters match our own characters. And so two people can play together, but also feel like they're also having an individual experience.
Right.
I've yet to find that to replicate what we did, 30 years ago. So that's really the sweet spot, would be to find a game that allowed that. Because the kids are about to go off to college, and then we're just going to be like alone playing Frogger.
I think a lot of people would be saying, oh, actually play more D&D, tabletop D&D.
Well, that's true. I mean, so my daughter got into tabletop D&D, and there was a brief moment last summer where we were going to, but then I made a mistake of deciding that I would be the dungeon master, and I wanted to follow the rules the way the rules are written, because if you don't follow the rules, come on. Anyway, I was seen as being too fastidious, and it broke down before we could get going.
That's a shame. Well, hey, thank you so much for your time. When Age of Empires 4 comes out, I'd love to have a 1v1 match with you at some point here.
Oh, Ben, that would be great, or we can just talk about it, because I would lose so badly. But and you've inspired me to go back to playing more regularly, because it used to be such a source of joy and escape, which is something we all need.
Oh yeah, they have a newish version of Age of Mythology on Steam, which is very much in that old school vein of Age of Empires, but with, it's got hero units and myth units and kind of some bigger swings from the different races in there. So it's very fun. Oh, good. Now, before you let me go, what should I try that I haven't talked about, or that's out there that might be intriguing? I mean, that's such a huge question. So I know it's a vast question. I know. So you're looking for either strategy. I mean, do you like any turn-based strategy? I know Civ is maybe too much, or you just like the idea of building up a town? No, I mean, the town doesn't have to be. I mean, I guess what I like is, you ever played the game Castle? Cathedral. Sorry, the board game Cathedral. So it's basically, it sort of looks like, it looks kind of like chess. It's kind of right between chess and checkers. Okay. Games last about a half an hour. They have tactile pieces, which are pleasing. And you play against somebody else, and you maneuver these buildings around in order to basically score the most points by the end of the game. It's a butchered way of explaining it. But what I love about it is the strategy doesn't have to be too complex. You need to have some strategy, but just scale of 1 to 10, it's like a 7. Time frame is half an hour to 45 minutes, so you don't have to invest the way you do with chess. But it's not so dumb that it's like, playing war or something. No offense to all those players of war out there. So it would be nice to be basically the author of my own strategy. And this is why Company of Heroes is a kind of quick hit in that way. The games are pretty, you can author a strategy. If it works, great. If it doesn't, you lose, and then you start over again. And I wouldn't mind even if like Call of Duty or those kinds of games had basically more slinking around and less being under constant fire and the hunted feeling that you're going to turn around and somebody's going to pick you off from 200 yards away. Right. Then a game like that would be fine too. Some more slinking around. Okay. Strategy and slinking. I'm really racking my brain. By the way, Ben, you don't have to answer this now. You can send me an email and I'll let you know how the experience goes. Okay, that sounds perfect. One more recommendation, if you like just quick strategy that would be great, in that time frame, is Into the Breach. It's a strategy game that came out a couple years ago where it's streamlined. It's very clear in the messaging of what you need to do. But if you just want, an interesting little pocket-sized experience of interesting, taking turns and making strategic decisions, Into the Breach might be a good option for you. Okay, great. Okay, perfect. All right, well, thank you for that. Sorry to put you on the spot. No, that's great. Thank you. I mean, I really enjoyed the book. I have my cool copy here. And I feel like you've probably gotten this message from a lot of people, but just in this era of the world, I just am so hungry for somebody to contextualize what we're going through, what is happening, how do you define what in the world is happening in a lot of different ways. And I feel like this book did a really great job of boiling things down and putting some recent presidencies in perspective in a way where it's like, okay, that's nice just to have this concrete look at this is how you can think of what we just went through and are still going through in a lot of ways.
Oh, well, that's great to hear. That's great. Well, that was my intent. So I'm glad to hear that it worked out. So I really appreciate it.
Oh, great. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. Good to talk to you.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for watching and listening to this interview from MinnMax. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel and check out our other interviews as well. See you next time. Bye! If you are sick of snark, clickbait, and an avalanche of movie news, you can help support independent games media by subscribing to MinnMax's YouTube channel here, or checking out the benefits over on Patreon. It's a nice, clean handshake. You support us, and we won't make dumb, condescending stuff for you. Your support helps us continue our mission of focusing on games, friends, and getting better. Patreon.com/MinnMax with 2 N's. We'd appreciate it.